Alright, I am back with another video, and today I've got something a little bit different. Now, let's imagine a future, alright? A slightly bleaker future than maybe the one that we're fighting for. I'm talking about a future where the Absolute won, or perhaps we became the Absolute if you play that one deity build, or maybe you just chose the evil ending in Baldur's Gate 3. What would that actually mean for the world? Well, I like to think that, well, most people would become mind flayers or mind flayer thralls, and the elder brain would reign supreme with you atop it. And I think that's like an interesting idea to kind of base a build on. Not somebody who, like, not making a build that, like, makes that future happen, but someone who has to deal with it. Now, I've taken inspiration from characters like Cable or Future Trunks here, and created what I'm calling the Survivor. The initial idea for the build was to create a character based on like those Left 4 Dead or other kind of like zombie shooters, but then it kind of evolved into more of an interesting concept involving time travel as like kind of the lore and basis for the story, which I felt was quite fun. So yeah, like we've got a character here who through some means, perhaps some chronomancy based artifact, or maybe some sort of artificer device that like can control the flow of time, they've managed to come back in time on a one-way trip to just before the events that would create the end of the world happened, and it's his job to stop them. And so we've got a grizzled old veteran type character who's really good with a gun and many other different types of weaponry. So you've got, like, you know, the ability to use melee and ranged weapons, although we mostly focus on ranged weapons because, of course, like, the Apocalypse Survivor is more known for using ranged weapons, shall we say. As well as the fact that, you know, you can use the alchemy system to be, like, crafting things like grenades and potions and such to really add to, like, the flavour of the build. And I will say, while the build I'll be showing off is quite simple, as I felt like most people would want to get 3 feats on this build, as well as the kind of feature that we'll be getting at level 11 here, I would say there's definitely room to kind of mix up how you do this build. I considered adding levels of Transmutation Wizard to get a bit more out of the alchemy side of things if you really wanted to lean into that route. There's also, I would say, room for like cleric levels as well if you really want to kind of go into like maybe this guy has like some sort of holy vibe to him, maybe in a similar vein to the deity build series. He was kind of chosen to be like a soul survivor who can go back in time and such like that. You know, there's a ton of different little like fun flavor things that you can kind of do with this build, so feel free to adjust the leveling scheme as to what you like. But I do kind of like the idea of going to at least level 11 with this build for a certain feature that's going to synergize with some things that we'll be doing later, as well as you know, you do have one level 3 regardless, but I did think grabbing that extra feat was pretty helpful for the build overall, so I would say it's up to personal preference, but I definitely think some levels of wizard, some levels of cleric could really make this build interesting if you want to kind of play with the leveling scheme here. So keep that in mind as we go throughout the build. What I'm going to be presenting is a rather simplified version that I think also works great for beginners who want to try out, you know, like maybe this type of playstyle, but otherwise there is some more complex things you could do with it if you want to turn up the flavor a little bit. But as far as, like I say, the alchemy system goes, you don't need Transmutation Wizard for that. You just technically get a little bit more out of it if you succeed those checks. Otherwise, you're pretty good regardless. So, without further ado, let's get into the build. First off, I've decided to play as a half-elf today. Don't know particularly why. I knew I wanted to play as either a wood half-elf or a wood elf, because I wanted the extra movement speed. I like having that little bit of extra movement speed that comes from the sub-race, which is getting that little bit extra, because it's great for characters who like ranged attacks. We also get the Civil Militia, so we kind of get that like human feel to it as well, because again, that kind of just fits the vibe, giving us weapon proficiency with spears, pikes, halberds, and glaives, as well as light armor and shields. We also get regular dark vision and fey ancestry, having advantage on saving throws against being charmed, and magic cannot put us to sleep. So overall, I think that's quite a fun thing. I like the idea of someone who is surviving a mind flayer apocalypse to just have a natural resistance to the charming effects of maybe the tadpole. And I would say if you even wanted to go even further with the flavor, you could say that like in the future, everyone gets infected with a tadpole sooner or later. It's just a matter of time, and then they become a thrall. But I can almost see you flavoring this as this guy maybe having some sort of similar protection, maybe divine in nature if you go down that cleric route, where they have protection from the tadpole's control even though they have one implanted in them, and then when they come back it's more the artifact, and then it fits into the lore of the game. I don't know, I think that could be kind of fun overall, so I'm quite happy to have that here. Moving on, we obviously are going to be playing as a ranger today. Now, I would say this build could also work with battle master, fighter, and all the other typical ranged build kind of classes, but I kind of like the idea of making the iconic ranger with a slightly different vibe, less of a nature's greatest warrior and more of a, you know, like general survivor, someone who has to live with what little they can find in order to survive, and I feel like ranger fits that build perfectly. And of course there's the iconic, you know, thing of like the ranger being the ranged class, using a bow, you know, and such like that. So I feel like turning that on its head and becoming like a survivalist feels quite fun. So we're going to be playing as a ranger today, because let's be honest, I don't use ranger enough. This is going to give us access to a few things at level 1, like simple and martial weapons, medium armor and shields as well, all that good stuff. We're also going to gain access to a favored enemy, and I kind of feature here. And while all of these are okay, I would say Ranger Knight is probably the best overall, because you're going to get heavy armor proficiency if you decide to go down that route. I do like having Bounty Hunter here, because obviously I do want to use Ensnaring Strike with this build, because it works with our ranged attacks, as well as the fact, right, that I kind of like the idea of this character maybe not having like innate power similar to how a ranger or like a druid would have it. You know, they kind of have power through like their connection to nature. I like the idea of this guy almost taking more of a wizard route, in which they literally had to learn how to use slightly more basic spellcasting just to survive. So again, maybe those wizard levels are looking more and more justified here. I don't know, it's up to you. But otherwise, I do think the Bounty Hunter works well here. Again, it makes sense to have a spell that can trap enemies to stop them from being able to chase you as someone who is trying to survive. So I think that works. Now, for your Natural Explorer, any of these will work. I think all of these fit the build quite nicely. Obviously, Wasteland Wanderer would be the most powerful options, but I just love the idea of having a apocalyptic survivor with like an animal companion. I don't know, maybe that's the Fallout fan in me, so I like grabbing Find Familiar here. Obviously, they come with a ton of advantages. Just having a familiar, you know, it helps with traversal and such like that, but it's also just a great roleplay feature. So I like having that around, but otherwise, obviously, the Wasteland Wanderer resistances are the most powerful. Moving on to our ability scores, pretty standard ranger spread here, nothing to write home about. Strength is a 10 to just give us a little bit of jumping distance, because I like to have that on my builds that require range. Dexterity is at 17, because we're going to be bumping that up with a half feat later. Constitution is at 14, a little bit on the low side, but for a ranged character who, again, is meant to be a vulnerable mortal in the world of the apocalypse, this feels just fine. Intelligence is at 8. I don't think this character is dumb, but they certainly wouldn't have had a formal education growing up in a world that is like this. And I know I've made a half-elf here who is quite old, so this is very far into the future, but so that this is happening, but hey, I mean, we can go as far into the future as we like. That's kind of the point. Wisdom is at 16. Again, we live off the land, we survive for scraps, and we're very knowledgeable about how to dodge mind flayers in an urban or rural environment. So I feel like wisdom does make sense here, and obviously we need it for our spellcasting as a ranger. And finally, charisma is at 8. This guy probably doesn't talk to people a lot, so, you know, I feel like this makes sense. Moving on to our skill proficiencies, we actually have quite a lot. Because I went with the Outlander background for obvious reasons, we gain Athletics and Survival, and of course if I make a build called The Survivor and I don't put Survival on it, there's a problem. So I feel like taking the Outlander background makes sense. We're also, because we're a wood elf, we get stealth for free, which is really, really nice. We get to get investigation from our feature that we grabbed earlier, as well as being able to choose nature, insight, and perception for our basic skill proficiencies as a ranger. So overall, we've got a very strong stat spread here at level 1, in which we just have a ton of features that fit our build nicely. So let's continue. Next up at Ranger level 2, we're going to get to pick up a few things, including our first 2 spells of the build. Now, it's entirely up to you what you want to go for here, as we're going to be picking up pretty much most of these as we go through the build, so it's really up to preference as to what you want to grab first. Obviously, I quite like Ensnaring Strike. I've already said why it's good flavor for the build, and we took the Bounty Hunter feature, so I think this is a good one to get right off the bat. If you've got the Mistress Spells mod installed, which I do recommend as it's one of the best balanced mods in the game that just adds a ton of new content, I would say you've got a few options here. Zephyr Strike is a really, really fun one. You are able to move like the wind and no longer provoke opportunity attacks, and before the spell ends you can perform Zephyr attack once. You gain advantage on your next attack roll and deal an additional 1d8 force damage to the target, and regardless of hitting, you increase your movement speed by 9 meters. For ranged builds, this is amazing, allowing your next shot to hit with extra force, while also being able to just get you to any place you want to go, no problem, and it only costs a bonus action in your concentration, so I think it's a good shot. But of course, if you're not playing with that mod, you've got other things you can work with. Speak of Animals for the flavour and roleplay, Longstrider for more movement speed, Enhanced Leap for more traversal, Hail of Thorns for another ranged weapon attack. We'll be getting a lot of spells like this. Hunter's Mark, I mean, it's the Ranger's bread and butter, especially in 24 D&D, yikes. So it's really up to you. I did try out Zephyr Strike in my testing, and I do think it works quite nicely, so I would recommend grabbing that here, especially since we're going to enjoy having advantage on this build. Because, of course, we're also going to be grabbing the Archery Fighting Style for a +2 to ranged weapon attacks. But, of course, if you have the Fighting Styles expanded mod, you do have a few extra options here, like Blind Fighting, Druidic Warrior. All of these are quite fun, but we're just going to keep it simple and go with Archery today. I've just realised I've been doing a lot of ranged builds recently. Huh. Anyways, moving on to our next level. We have level 3, and we get to choose our subclass. But first, another spell. I'm going to grab Hail of Thorns. Now, for our subclass, I would say, obviously, any of these will work. If you really want to go for the Fallout style, you know, you got dog meat with you, then Beastmaster is always going to be a fun shout. I would say Gloomstalker can also work if you want to lean more into the stealth aspect, but I haven't exactly built a Hunter in a while, so that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, for your Hunter's Prey passive, I always recommend Colossus Slayer, because obviously it's just free extra damage once per turn. However, for a build like this that's based on a zombie apocalypse survivor, living in a world where everything is out to kill you, Last of Us style, I really like Horde Breaker. Horde Breaker allows you to target 2 creatures standing close to each other, attacking them in quick succession. Works with melee or ranged. So if you've got 2 enemy targets that are right next to each other, you can basically get a 2-for-1 combo. Now, I will say, once we hit Hunter Ranger 11, spoilers, we're going that far, you will get the Volley ability, which I'll talk about later, which kind of makes Horde Breaker obsolete. So I would say once you reach that level, respec and grab Colossus Slayer instead for your kind of, like, just for the extra damage, right? There's no reason not to take this, because once you get Volley, you know, that's just basically a better version of Horde Breaker. So, in my opinion, that's what you want to grab. Or you can keep Horde Breaker, because technically if enemies are really grouped together, you can use Volley and Horde Breaker in the same turn, which would allow you to attack multiple enemies twice rather than the once per turn that Volley is normally limited to. So, I mean, it is an option. However, I do think overall Colossus Slayer will do the better job in the long run. So, moving on. At level 4 of Ranger, we're going to get to choose our first feat. And I mean, it's a ranged build, and I love taking this ability on ranged builds, so we're going to go for the Athlete feat. This is going to bump up our dexterity to an 18, increasing our jump distance by 50%, and also gives us more movement speed if we're knocked prone. It's just overall great for mobility. Ranged builds love this type of thing. If that's not your thing, though, and you maybe wanted to start with a slightly different score, so you don't have to round up with a feat, you can go for things like, mobile, if you want more movement speed as well. Although that requires melee attacks, that might not be your thing. We are using a crossbow with this build, so crossbow expert could be your thing, but I feel like in most cases, if you're playing a crossbow playstyle, you're probably going to want to play at ranged, which in my opinion makes crossbow expert kind of meh. The piercing shot feature is nice, but if you're playing a crossbow build, you probably don't want to be in melee range in the first place. But again, that's sometimes just unavoidable, so entirely up to you. There's also stuff from Tash's feats as well, if you feel like you want to go down that route. But otherwise, I do think Athlete is a good way to start off the build. At Ranger level 5, we're getting extra attack. You know it, you love it. We're also going to gain access to level 2 spells at this point. And again, you've got a bunch of options here. Now, obviously, all the typical stuff is still here. Like I said, Hunter's Mark, Spike Growth, Passive Outtrace would make sense for someone who's an apocalypse survivor. Maybe they ran with a group for a while. You know, there's a ton of different things that could work here. But again, I want to take a little jump over to Mistress Spells, again, keeping things a bit more interesting, and grab Volley of Arrows. This is basically Magic Missile for a ranged piercing damage attack that is fired from your gun. You fire 5 arrows that each deal a d6 of piercing damage, for a total of 5d6 if you decide to go for a single person, or you can spread out that damage across multiple people, like a controlled spray of like a firearm. So overall, I think flavor-wise, it does work. Is it the most powerful in the world? No. But I think that's what makes it fun, because it's a decent spell that will allow you to spread damage over a wide area, and they don't have to be close to each other as well. You basically just go bam, 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 bam. It's kind of like the VAT system, I guess, from Fallout, or maybe even Deadeye from Red Dead 2. Yeah, I think it's pretty fun, so we're going to take that here. Moving on to Ranger 6, we get another favoured enemy and natural explorer feature. Now again, it's entirely up to you what you want to go with. I like the idea of going with Ranger Knight, not only because it gives us a bit more to work with in terms of our armor choices if you wanted to go up to heavy armor, but also Ranger Knight is going to give us history proficiency, which I guess for us would just be today proficiency, because we're from the future. Huh. Time travel's weird. Anyways, moving on to Natural Explorer, of course, pick whatever you like here. Urban Tracker would be great for sleight of hand checks, which again, I feel like this character would do, so I'm going to be grabbing that, but of course, any of the Wasteland Wanderer features are there if you just want that damage resistance. Moving on to Ranger level 7, we're going to gain a new passive from Hunter called a Defensive Tactic, and we've got a few that I think all kind of makes sense for this build. You've got Escape the Horde, making it so opportunity attacks against you have disadvantage. We will be getting this from an item later, so I would say, unless you don't want to use that item, Escape the Horde is probably the least useful here. Steel Will allow you to have Unshakable Resolve that grants you advantage on saving throws against being frightened. You've seen it all at this point, nothing phases you, which I think makes sense. And we also have Multi-Attack Defense, which would probably be what I would personally go with. Multi-attack defense allows it so that when an enemy attacks you, they have a -4 penalty to additional attack rolls against you until the start of their next turn. So basically, if someone has multiple attacks that they do in a single turn, those subsequent attacks are way less likely to hit, which is actually going to synergize with our playstyle very nicely. So I do quite like this here, but I do think any of these can work depending on your equipment choices. And again, we do get another spell up to level 2 here. Again, it's a pick your favorite type situation. I think we do have most of what I would suggest for this build already. So really, it's down to preference. Like I say, if you just want a nice passive buff, that can work. Maybe you could flavor Goodberry even as like you scrounging for food. In fact, you know what? Everyone loves a snack. Let's take Goodberry. At Ranger level 8, we're going to get our class feature, Landstride Difficult Terrain, meaning that difficult terrain no longer slows us down. Very, very nice. We're light-footed and we're able to sneak past things, so yeah, I guess it makes sense. We're also going to be able to take another feat at this point, and I think level 8 is appropriate for when we could pick up Sharpshooter, not only because it won't feel too overpowered at this point, but as well as the fact that we will have the equipment to help us and the abilities that will help us offset that penalty by this point. This allows our ranged weapon attacks to ignore the high ground rules, as well as giving us an additional 10 damage at the cost of a -5 penalty to hit. Obviously, archery already helps with that a little bit, but we'll get some more stuff later that'll help even more. At Ranger level 9, we're going to get another spell, and at this point, we're up to level 3. And again, there's a bunch of options to choose from here, so let's have a look at what we've got. Conjure Barrage is going to allow you to attack using your weapon, either melee or ranged, in a cone in front of you. Basically, if we wanted to flavor this like a shotgun blast to everyone right in front of us, which I think could be quite fun, I'll probably take that at some point. There's also Lightning Arrow, being able to charge our ammo with a specialized shot. And while I'm on the topic of elemental arrows, please, again, use the alchemy system to craft arrows of ice, arrows of fire, smoke powder bombs, stuff like that, because I think that can make this build really, really fun. There's also some other stuff here, like Summon Fae, if you want to go down that route, flame arrows, if you want to go with, like, incendiary rounds, that could be kind of fun. That does require concentration, though, so be careful of that. Sense Vitals as well, if you want to deal a bit of extra damage there. There's so many different ways you could go for it. I would absolutely say, though, that like something like Flame Arrows could be really fun if you're playing with Mistress spells, so I'm going to go with that. I would also say if you find that you're not using some of your lower level spells at this point, perhaps Hail of Thorns has started to fall off, I don't know. Maybe even something like Zephyr Strike isn't really working for you, perhaps you're not liking the fact that it's concentration based, feel free to swap those out. At Ranger level 10, we're going to get yet another favoured enemy and Natural Explorer feature, as well as Hide in Plain Sight, allowing you to become invisible and gain a +10 bonus to stealth checks as long as you stand still. I mean, it's literally blending in with your environment. I think that makes sense for a build like this. Moving on though, favoured enemy, and I would say at this point, it's kind of a pick your favourite situation. You could gain proficiency in Arcana and gain True Strike from Magebreaker, or Protection from Evil and get Keeper of the Veil. But again, maybe keeping in with that like clerical idea, I could say that that like getting religion and sacred flame from Sanctified Stalker could be really fun. Maybe the Mind Flayers have started raising the dead to fill out their ranks, heck, making the zombie survival thing more apparent. And I definitely think that if someone is surviving in a zombie apocalypse in a fantasy land like from D&D and the Forgotten Realms, I mean, I think it makes sense to have some radiant damage in your back pocket just in case, even though it's not really our thing. Moving on though to Natural Explorer, we do get to finally pick one of those 3 resistances. And again, if we're talking about zombie survival specifically, just from the inspiration, then poison would obviously make the most sense. But I think fire, maybe we work with fire a lot, obviously, and fire is a damage type that comes up a lot. I would definitely say that Wasteland Wanderer Fire is probably going to be the most useful for you. At level 11 of a ranger, we finally get what we came here for. Volley and Whirlwind Attack. Whirlwind Attack allows you to use your melee weapon to attack anyone around you, kind of like Link from The Legend of Zelda. Hey, I made that build. We also have Volley, which allows you to basically attack in a radius around where the ammo would land. Imagine like you are tossing a grenade, but it's actually like an explosive shot from your firearm. That's kind of how it works. So it's like a radius from the impact point. So you don't have to hit an enemy directly with this. You basically just plop the AoE on them, and then bam, everyone in that range will take weapon damage, which stacks with Sharpshooter, so we're hitting everyone in a small radius for Sharpshooter damage, as well as all the other fun stuff that can come with effects based on like our weapon attacks, which again, we'll talk about in a minute. But we also do get to choose another spell at this point, and while I will say Conjure Barrage does sound like an obvious choice, especially with the flavouring that I gave it, I didn't actually find it to be that useful. The extra damage is nice, but it didn't really help a lot. It kind of felt like a weaker version of Volley in a lot of cases. While this one doesn't have the, close range disadvantage problem, because obviously it's a cone in front of you, I don't think it's strong enough to justify. Lightning Arrow, however, absolutely is. I feel like it's a fun, flavorful option for the build. I feel like it's putting that fantasy twist on typical firearms and such like that, and having another damage type in our back pocket is always good. So we're going to go with Lightning Arrow. And finally, at Ranger level 12, we are going to get an extra feat. However, of course, there are those 1-level dips that you could have taken at any point in the build that could help you. There's obviously things like Fighter, maybe if you want another fighting style. Monk, if you want more dex-based attacks and a bit more movement speed, if you want to go maybe down the unarmored defense route. Totally possible. There's also Bard as well. I mean, that's just a thing anyway. Rogue, always nice. Maybe that sneak attack for a little bit of extra damage could be fun. And like I say, Wizard, definitely a solid pick in my opinion. Maybe not so much as a 1-level dip for this build, but if you do want to go for that 2nd level, if you don't care about Volley so much, which I do, it's entirely up to you. However, I do think this build definitely benefits from a full Hunter Ranger build, going for an ability score improvement and maxing out that dexterity. And that is the build. Overall, what you're going to be getting out of this is a pretty standard Ranger overall. Again, the build itself is not too mechanically complex, which is why I said it can work well for beginners. You know, you're getting a powerful ranged attack. I mean, just our basic ranged attack is doing upwards of 31 damage, which is nice. But of course, you also get all the useful effects of things like Ensnaring Strike, you know, the ranged attack variants of Volley, which can help attack multiple enemies, which is great. You get the extra damage from something like Colossus Slayer. You've got Volley of Arrows to hit multiple enemies across the whole battlefield. Hail of Thorns for extra damage there. And also even Lightning Arrow and Flame Arrows, which I think both work really, really well. So yeah, overall, I feel like we've got a pretty solid kit here, at least in my opinion. Again, the build itself is not too complex, but I think with the lore that we have and kind of like the inspiration, I feel like it works. Again, I feel like a lot of people who really want to go down this route would probably just make a Battlemaster fighter, since that's technically more gunplay focused. But I really wanted to throw in that D&D flair, and I like the idea of a ranger being a apocalypse survivor in the future. I don't know, that's just me. Perhaps I really just want to make ranger more interesting. I'm sorry, ranger fans, but come on, you kind of got to agree with me here. Let's talk about the equipment and how it's going to help us out. So, obviously, let's start with our main weapon, our ranged weapon of choice, the Giant Breaker. Now, the Giant Breaker is really fun. It's a +1 weapon that you can obtain really early on in the game, so you're going to get your main gun super quick. But the main thing it's going to do for us is hit hard enough to send targets reeling for 2 turns. Now, picture this. Every single, like, zombie apocalypse show or game or whatever has that scene where someone's about to be eaten by one of the undead, then someone shoots that undead from far away, causing them to go down or their attack to miss or something like that. Well, that is what the Giant Breaker does. Whenever we hit someone with one of our attacks, attacks, they're going to be sent reeling for 2 turns, and the reeling status effect makes it so that for every turn remaining, they have a -1 penalty to attack rolls, meaning that we can spread, using things like volley, because it works with volley, we can spread damage to multiple people, also reducing their chance to hit, giving us a huge supporting element to our build, as well as the sheer amount of damage that we're already doing. However, this is a +1 weapon though, so I did decide to buff it with the Drakethroat Glaive to give it a bit of extra damage of your choice. I went with Thunder because I consider it like more of a neutral damage type, but things like Fire and whatever works for your current situation would obviously also make sense. Again, special ammo types. But of course, you buff it with the Drakethroat Glaive to get that extra buff. However, I actually do think the Drakethroat Glaive makes a lot of sense as a melee weapon for this build. Any glaive works though, but if you don't feel like grabbing multiple weapons, you just want one to just slot in the melee slot, then this will work. This will allow you to make it so that obviously you can cast Draconic Elemental Weapon either on this or on your ranged weapon, giving it that elemental buff, but it's also a +2 weapon that has long reach, which I think makes sense for this build. Again, if you're going to have to fight in melee, you're going to want something that has a long reach to stop things from biting you or grabbing you and then trying to eat your brain. You know, I feel like it does make sense. Oh wait, hey, yeah, mind flayers and zombies both eat brains. That's just occurred to me. How did I not make that connection earlier? Bloody hell. Anyways. But of course, there's other things that can work with this, like any of the pikes. The Dancing Breeze is a finesse-based glaive that could really work. In fact, it might work better than this, since this one is still strength-based, but can still work in a pinch. But I guess if you really want a glaive, go with the Dancing Breeze. But otherwise, if you're mainly just sticking with the ranged weapon attacks, you're going to want this for the buff that it provides. Anyways, moving on to our equipment. First up in our head slot, I went with the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. Basically, whenever we deal damage with a weapon attack, we're going to gain Arcane Acuity, which increases our spell attack rolls and spell save DC. So if we're just making regular shots of our weapon, it makes our spells that we use our weapon with that much more effective. So flame arrows, all that sort of thing. The spell save DCs are higher, so saving throws are going to be harder, and if they're attack roll based, they're going to have a higher chance to hit. Overall, it gives us a bit of an incentive to use our spell-based attacks as well as our regular attacks, even with only having a 16 in Wisdom. I think it synergizes with the build quite nicely, so I recommend it. Now, this is a pretty uncreative choice, I will admit, but the Sharpened Snare Cuirass is just one of the best things for Ranger, I would say, around the mid-game. You add your full Dexterity modifier to your armor class, and creatures will have disadvantage on saving throws when resisting your attacks and spells that inflict restraint. So if you don't want to take Bounty Hunter in this build, you don't have to, as long as you wear this armor. These two features do not overlap, unfortunately. They do kind of just do the same thing, so it is an option available to you, but you can still keep Bounty Hunter and then swap this armor for something else. You want the Armor of Agility? Go for that. That's a powerful endgame option, but I did want something that felt like it was cobbled together, still keeping the Ranger identity, but also having that kind of Survivor feel. And you can tell that this armor like has stitching everywhere, you know, its various different pelts kind of smashed together. It feels like a Survivor outfit, which I really wanted to kind of get across with this build, so yeah, I like this here, so feel free to change that up if you like, but I think it works and makes sense. I also would say that even though I don't think it goes with the fashion, you could slap the Cloak of Protection on here if you want to. Again, I don't really like it fashion-wise, but it would round out our AC to a nice even 20, so feel free to keep that in mind. For our gloves, I've gone with the Bone Spike gloves. It's got a nice design with these like runes on the arms, which I think can have all sorts of fun roleplay implications if you want to come up with an interesting backstory for that. However, it does give us the incredible buff of that our attacks will ignore resistance to slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning damage. I think this is quite important for this build, since a lot of what we do is piercing damage. Going up against something that is a Steel Watcher that's going to resist that is going to feel pretty crappy, even with things like Sharpshooter. Being able to bypass all of those resistances feels very nice in practice, and maybe that's just because I do most of my testing on Steel Watchers, but I honestly think it's quite good. However, you don't really care about that. A good early game option is the Gloves of Archery, giving all of your ranged attacks an additional 2 flat damage, which is nice. It works great as an early game option, but I do think if you're having trouble with overcoming resistances, then I do think that the Bone Spike Gloves are going to be better than just that +2 damage. Moving on to the boots, it's the Boots of Speed. Like I said, this is why Escape the Horde might not be useful, because Click Heals allows us to, as a bonus action, dash as well as provoke disadvantage on opportunity attacks against us, so we're pretty much always going to have that available. Again, this is a ranged build. Having more movement speed on ranged builds is always great, and having that disadvantage on opportunity attacks is even better, allowing us to get away without necessarily having to disengage. Doesn't work all the time, but it works most of the time. 99% of the time, it works 100% of the time. I'm pretty sure that's how that meme goes. Moving on to our accessories, I've gone for the Spell Savant Amulet. Really, anything can go in this slot, it's not a huge deal, but I like the idea of having an extra level 2 spell slot on this build since rangers have limited spell slots. And look, it's really cool because all the spell slots on our hotbar are even, 4, 4, 4, and it looks very satisfying to me. Like, look, this is bad. This is nice. Moving on to our rings, we have the Killer's Sweetheart Ring, allowing us to, whenever we kill a creature, our next attack roll can be a critical hit. We basically just get a reaction that we can bank and then spend to do a critical hit whenever we want, once per long rest. This, again, getting, like, again, the zombie apocalypse movies where they get that lucky headshot in that, like, can save the day against a potentially, like, dangerous situation. And again, the fact that we ignore resistance and all that makes that critical hit feel very, very strong. So I wanted to include it here. And finally, the Smuggler's Ring. Again, we're not a people person, because everyone's dead or a mind flayer, so taking away a point of charisma isn't really a huge deal on this build. To give us a +2 to sleight of hand and stealth feels pretty nice of our high dexterity, so I quite like having this here, but again, this is more of a lore and flavor thing that you can just get early on in the game. It's an Act 1 thing, so feel free to change it up if you so desire. But yeah, overall, that is the equipment. Again, I feel like from a build-making perspective, it's nothing too special, but overall, it is strong, powerful, flavorful. I like it. Anyways, quickly going on, there's no camp clothing this time, but we do have 3 dyes that I've used for this build. Our main armor is coated in the Grumbar dye from Faerunian Colours, which all of these dyes are from, available on all platforms, which gives us this nice kind of like faded green and brown, which I think works for our ranger. Kalemvor dye being used on the braces, I think, and the mask dye being used on the boots. So 3 different dyes here to create this overall look, which I'm quite fond of. But yeah, that is the build, and overall, like I say, probably not my most creative build, I'm not gonna lie, but I like the flavor and the lore behind it, and this build and this channel as a whole is just as much about the roleplay and the lore of the characters as much as it is about the actual build itself. And I don't think I've ever built just a pure hunter ranger before, correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am. Was the Link build a pure hunter ranger, or did I throw a level of cleric in there? I can't remember, but maybe it was. I don't know. But overall, this is a pretty fun build overall. I mean, it's powerful. Again, it's a Sharpshooter ranger build. Those are always going to do the trick. You've got a ton of different options to spread damage over a wide area of things like Volley, Horde Breaker if you're going with that, and if you have Mistress spells, you just have more fun options available to you that make this feel a bit more unique. Is it the most exciting build in the world? No. Is it fun? Yes. Is it the most inventive or creative? No. Is it effective? Yes. You kind of have to weigh the pros and cons whenever you make builds like this, and I'm not gonna lie, guys, I needed patch 8 to come out like yesterday. I've got so many things I want to do with Blade Singer, Swarmkeeper, even Arcane Archer, for crying out loud. I've made enough ranged builds, I'm just trying to manifest Arcane Archer into existence. And of course, we've got a ton of fun stuff planned for when that comes out. So again, I'm kind of just getting those like concepts that are like, yeah, that's fun and cool, but it's not as cool as what I could do with patch 8. So we're just getting these kind of builds, you know, out of the way. We just kind of want to, you know, do this sort of thing. Does that mean I'm trying to discount this build? Yes, but actually no. Play this build. It's fun, especially if you got some sort of maybe mod or something that adds a bunch of stuff. I mean, hell, this one in Act 2 is going to feel right at home. But yeah, anyways, I'm going to stop rambling for now because I'm done. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.